All right, we are coming up on 8 o'clock. So, let's settle in, get comfortable, grab our books, grab a drink, and let's jump back in to where we left off. Welcome back. This is our second night of reading from L. Frank Baum's The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. Now, if that author sounds familiar, you may remember that this was the author and the source of The Wizard of Oz and the world of Oz as we know it. So you have him to thank for Wicked and the new movies and all the classic movie, as well as the series of children's books that are a little less well known than things like Narnia and the like, but just as well widespread and influential. It may not have been his idea, but you know what? The father of things is the father of things. Alright, so this has been a fun read so far. As I'd mentioned earlier, this is a nice origin story of Santa Claus. We've seen an interesting spin. It's almost a distinct and purposeful secular take to separate Santa from the religious roots of the holiday and bring it back into sort of where the holiday really original came from, was the various winter festivals that predated any of the sort of civilization as we know it. So we have the Fae things, we have the nature spirits and their own twists and new mythology sprung up out of the imagination of Baum. And it works. It does work. We've seen how Claus, who will come to be known in some circles as Nicholas, or Santa Claus, later down the line, was raised by spirits of the forest, and given a grand tour of the world by the master woodsman of the world, Ak, and found that his calling was to leave his forest home and try to bring joy to all the children of the world. And he's just come to realize that all children includes both the rich and the poor children. It's not the children's fault who their parents are. And so, there's no reason to discriminate between them. It's a good way to think. And the fact that this came about in the early 1900s is a poignant thought that, you know what, the people who think good things haven't really changed their minds all that much over the years. It's to be at the root a good person has been pretty constant throughout the ages. Whether that goodness is motivated by religion, economics, or just wanting to be a good person, or to provide good morals for children, this is a children's book, remember, is, while up to debate, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we just hope that people will be good, and so we give good examples and good role models. And Santa is one of the best role models, being both motivation and example rolled into one. So, let's continue tonight's reading from partway through the adulthood of Santa Claus, and as he's growing into the man that many of us have come to know through our own childhoods. At the end of last night's reading, we were introduced to the Ogwas, the evil influences, the halfway between mortals and immortals that were doing their best to prevent Claus from providing joy and happiness to the children of the world, at least from his surroundings, because happy children don't give in to wickedness, and they are never naughty. So, let's come back into the reading now from Chapter 7 of Part 2 of The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. The Great Battle Between Good and Evil. It's a little heavy for a children's book. A little heavy for a Santa book. Ak listened gravely to the recital of Claus, stroking his beard with the slow, graceful motion that betokened deep thought. He nodded approvingly when Claus told how the Nooks and Fairies had saved him from death, and frowned when he heard how the Awgwas had stolen the children's toys. At last he said, "From the beginning, I have approved the work you are doing among the children of men, and it annoys me that your good deeds should be thwarted by the Awgwas. We immortals have no connection whatever with the evil creatures who have attacked you. Always have we avoided them, and they, in turn, have hitherto taken care not to cross our pathway. But in this matter, I find they have interfered with one of our friends, and I will ask them to abandon their persecutions, as you are under our protection." Yes, asking has always worked before. Claus thanked the Master Woodsman most gratefully, and returned to his valley, while Ak, who never delayed carrying out his promises, at once traveled to the mountains of the Awgwas. There, standing on the bare rocks, he called on the king and his people to appear. Instantly, the place was filled with throngs of the scowling Awgwas, and their king, perching himself on a point of rock, demanded fiercely, "Who dares call on us?" "It is I, the Master Woodsman of the world," responded Ak. "There are no forests for you to claim," cried the king angrily. "We have no allegiance to you, nor to any immortal." "That is true," replied Ak calmly. "Yet you have ventured to interfere with the actions of Claus, who dwells in the Laughing Valley and is under our protection." Many of the Awgwas began muttering at this speech, and their king turned threateningly on the Master Woodsman. "You are set to rule the forests, but the plains and the valleys are ours," he shouted. "Keep your own dark woods. We'll do as we please with Claus." "You shall not harm our friend in any way," replied Ak. "Shall we not?" asked the king impudently. "You will see. Our powers are vastly superior to those of mortals, and fully as great as those of the immortals." "It is your conceit that misleads you," said Ak sternly. "You are a transient race, passing from life into nothingness. We, who live forever, but pity, but despise you. On earth you are scorned by all, and in heaven you have no place. Even the mortals, after their earth life, enter another existence for all time, and so are your superiors. How then dare you, who are neither mortal nor immortal, refuse to obey my wish?" The Awgwas sprang to their feet with menacing gestures, but their king motioned them back. "Never before," he cried to Ak, while his voice trembled with rage, "has an immortal declared himself the master of the Awgwas. Never shall an immortal venture to interfere with our actions again. For we will avenge your scornful words by killing your friend Claus within 3 days. Nor you, nor all your immortals can save him from our wrath. We defy your powers. Begone, Master Woodsman of the world. In the country of the Awgwas, you have no place." "It is war," declared Ak, with flashing eyes. "It is war," returned the king savagely. "In 3 days, your friend will be dead." The master turned away and came to his forest of Burzee, where he called a meeting of the immortals and told them of the defiance of the Awgwas, and their purpose to kill Claus within 3 days. The little folk listened to him quietly. "What shall we do?" asked Ak. "These creatures are of no benefit to the world," said the Prince of the Nooks. "We must destroy them." "Their lives are devoted only to evil deeds," said the Prince of the Rills. "We must destroy them." "They have no conscience, and endeavour to make all mortals as bad as themselves," said the Queen of the Fairies. "We must destroy them." "They have defied the great Ak, and threatened the life of our adopted son," said the beautiful Queen Zerline. "We must destroy them." The Master Woodsman smiled. "You speak well," said he. These Ogwars we know to be a powerful race, and they will fight desperately. Yet the outcome is certain, for we who live can never die, even though conquered by our enemies. While every Ogwar who is struck down is one foe the less to oppose us. Prepare, then, for battle, and let us resolve to show no mercy to the wicked. Thus arose that terrible war between the immortals and the spirits of evil, which is sung of in fairyland to this very day. The King Ogwa and his band determined to carry out the threat to destroy Claus. They now hated him for two reasons. He made children happy, and he was a friend of the Master Woodsman. But since Ax's visit, they had reason to fear the opposition of the immortals, and they dreaded defeat. So the king sent swift messengers to all parts of the world to summon every evil creature to his aid. And on the third day after the declaration of war, a mighty army was at the command of the King Ogwa. There were 300 Asiatic dragons, breathing fire that consumed everything it touched. These hated mankind and all good spirits. And there were the three-eyed giants of Tartary, a host in themselves, who liked nothing better than to fight. And next came the black demons from Catalonia, with great spreading wings like those of a bat, which swept terror and misery through the world as they beat upon the air. And joined to these were the Guzel goblins. Okay, Baum. The Guzel goblins, with long talons as sharp as swords, with which they clawed the flesh from their foes. Finally, every mountain Ogwa in the world had come to participate in the great battle with the immortals. The King Ogwa looked around upon his vast army, and his heart beat high with wicked pride, for he believed he would surely triumph over his gentle enemies, who had never before known to fight. But the Master Woodsman had not been idle. None of his people was used to warfare, yet now that they were called upon to face the hosts of evil, they willingly prepared for the fray. Ak had commanded them to assemble in the Laughing Valley, where Claus, ignorant of the terrible battle that was to be waged on his account, was quietly making his toys. Soon the entire valley from hill to hill was filled with the little immortals. The Master Woodsman stood first, bearing a gleaming axe that shone like burnished silver. Next came the Rills, armed with sharp thorns from bramble bushes. Then the Nooks, bearing the spears they used when they were forced to prod their savage beasts into submission. The fairies, dressed in white gauze with rainbow-hued wings, bore golden wands, and the wood nymphs, in their uniforms of oak-leaf green, carried switches from ash trees as weapons. Loud laughed the Ogwa king when he beheld the size and the arms of his foes. To be sure, the mighty axe of the woodsman was much to be dreaded, but the sweet-faced nymphs and the pretty fairies, the gentle rills and crooked nooks were such harmless folk that he almost felt shame at having called such a terrible host to oppose them.
"Since these fools dare to fight," he said to the leader of the Tartary giants, "I will overwhelm them with our evil powers."
To begin the battle, he poised a great stone in his left hand and cast it full against the sturdy form of the Master Woodsman, who turned it aside with his axe. Then rushed the three-eyed giants of Tartary upon the Nooks, and the Guzel goblins upon the Rills, and the fire-breathing dragons upon the sweet fairies. Because the nymphs were Ak's own people, the band of Ogwas sought them out, thinking to overcome them with ease. But it is the law that while evil, unopposed, may accomplish terrible deeds, the powers of good can never be overthrown when opposed to evil. Well had it been for the King Ogwa had he known the law. His ignorance cost him his existence, for one flash of the axe borne by the Master Woodsman of the world cleft the wicked king in twain, and rid the earth of the vilest creature it contained, and rid me of the need to do that voice again. greatly marveled, the tottery giants, when the spears of the little nooks pierced their thick walls of flesh and sent them reeling to the ground with howls of agony. Woe came upon the sharp-taloned goblins when the thorns of the rills reached their savage hearts and let their lifeblood sprinkle all the plain. And afterward, from every drop a thistle grew. The dragons paused astonished before the fairy wands, from whence rushed a power that caused their fiery breaths to flow back on themselves, so that they shriveled away and died. As for the Ogwars, they had scant time to realize how they were destroyed, for the ash switches of the nymphs bore a charm unknown to any Ogwar, and turned their foes into clods of earth at the slightest touch. When Ak leaned upon his gleaming axe, and turned to look over the field of battle, he saw the few giants who were able to run disappearing over the distant hills in their return to Tottery. The goblins had perished every one. As to the terrible dragons, while all that remained of the wicked Ogwars was a great number of... as had the terrible dragons. While all that remained of the wicked Ogwars was a great number of earthen hillocks dotting the plain. And now, the immortals melted from the valley like dew at sunrise, to resume their duties in the forest, while Ak slowly walked and thoughtfully to the house of Claus and entered. "You have many toys ready for the children," said the woodsman, "and now you may carry them across the plain to the dwellings and the villages without fear." "Will not the Ogwars harm me?" asked Claus eagerly. "The Ogwars," said Ak, "have perished. Now, I will gladly have done with wicked spirits, and with fighting and bloodshed. It was not from choice that I told of the Ogwars and their allies, and of their great battle with the immortals. They were part of this history, and could not be avoided." That's the end of chapter 7. And that ends with a bit of a poignant note there. History is not to be ignored when it is inconvenient. Not even in children's fiction. So, Baum gives a good lesson, couched in his narration there. We'll give it to him. And yes, Goozle Goblin is a name. That is certainly a thing. It was a choice. Yeah, this is peak Baum. Little bit of cute stuff to disarm the absolute war crimes going on. All right, continuing on with chapter 8, because we do have a lot to get through tonight. Those were happy days for Claus, when he carried his accumulation of toys to the children who had awaited them so long. During his imprisonment in the valley, he had been so industrious that all his shelves were filled with playthings, and after quickly supplying the little ones living nearby, he saw he must now extend his travels to wider fields. Remembering the time when he had journeyed with Ak through all the world, he knew children were everywhere, and he longed to make as many as possible happy with his gifts. So he loaded a great sack with all kinds of toys, slung it upon his back that he might carry it more easily, and started off on a longer trip than he had yet undertaken. Wherever he showed his merry face, in hamlet or in farmhouse, he received a cordial welcome, for his fame had spread into far lands. At each village the children swarmed about him, following his footsteps wherever he went, and the women thanked him gratefully for the joy he brought their little ones, and the men looked upon him curiously that he should devote his time to such a queer occupation as toy-making. But everyone smiled on him and gave him kindly words, and Claus felt amply repaid for his long journey. When his sack was empty, he went back again to the Laughing Valley and once more filled it to the brim. This time he followed another road, into a different part of the country, and carried happiness to many children who never before had owned a toy, or guessed that such delightful playthings existed. After a third journey, so far away that Claus was many days walking the distance, the store of toys became exhausted, and without delay he set about making a fresh supply. From seeing so many children and studying their tastes, he had acquired several new ideas about toys. The dollies were, he had found, the most delightful of all the playthings for babies and little girls, and often those who could not say dolly would call for a doll in their sweet baby talk. So Claus resolved to make many dolls of all sizes, and to dress them in bright-colored clothing. The older boys, and even some of the girls, loved the images of animals, and so he still made cats and elephants and horses, and many of the little fellows had musical natures, and longed for drums and cymbals and whistles and horns. So he made a number of toy drums, with tiny sticks to beat them with, and he made whistles from the willow trees, and horns from the bog reeds, and cymbals from bits of beaten metal. All this kept him busily at work, and before he realized it, the winter season came, with deeper snows than usual, and he knew he could not leave the valley with his heavy pack. Moreover, the next trip would take him farther from home than ever before, and Jack Frost was mischievous enough to nip his nose and ears if he undertook the long journey while the Frost King reigned. The Frost King was Jack's father, and never reproved him for his pranks. So Claus remained at his workbench, but he whistled and sang as merrily as ever, for he would allow no disappointment to sour his temper or make him unhappy. One bright morning, he looked from his window and saw 2 of the deer he had known in the forest walking toward his house. Claus was surprised, not that the friendly deer should visit him, but that they walked on the surface of the snow as easily as if it were solid ground, notwithstanding the fact that throughout the valley the snow lay many feet deep. He had walked out of his house a day or 2 before, and had sunk to his armpits in a drift. So, when the deer came near, he opened the door and called to them. "Good morning, Flossie. Tell me, how are you able to walk on the snow so easily?" "It is frozen hard," answered Flossie. "The Frost King has breathed on it," said Glossie, coming up. "The surface is now solid as ice." "Perhaps," remarked Claus thoughtfully, "I might now carry my pack of toys to the children." "Is it a long journey?" asked Flossie. "Yes, it will take me many days, for the pack is heavy," answered Claus. "Then the snow would melt before you could get back," said the deer. "You must wait until spring, Claus." Claus sighed. "Had I your fleet feet," said he, "I could make the journey in a day." "But you have not," returned Glossie, looking down at his own slender legs with pride. "Perhaps I could ride upon your back," Claus ventured to remark after a pause. "Oh no, our backs are not strong enough to bear your weight," said Flossie decidedly. "But if you had a sledge and could harness us to it, we might draw you easily, and your pack as well." "I'll make a sledge!" exclaimed Claus. "Will you agree to draw me if I do?" "Well," replied Flossie, "we must first go and ask the Knooks, who are our guardians, for permission. But if they consent, and you can make a sledge and harness, we will gladly assist you." "Then go at once!" cried Claus eagerly. "I am sure the friendly Knooks will give their consent, and by the time you are back, I shall be ready to harness you to my sledge." Flossie and Glossie, being deer of much intelligence, had long wished to see the great world, so they gladly ran over the frozen snow to ask the Knooks if they might carry Claus on his journey. Meantime, the toy maker hurriedly began the construction of a sledge, using material from his woodpile. He made 2 long runners that turned upward at the front ends, and across these nailed short boards to make a platform. It was soon completed, but was as rude in appearance as it was possible for a sledge to be. The harness was more difficult to prepare, but Claus twisted strong cords together and knotted them so they would fit around the necks of the deer in the shape of a collar. From these ran other cords to fasten the deer to the front of the sledge. Before the work was completed, Glossie and Flossie were back from the forest, having been granted permission by Will Knook to make the journey with Claus, provided they would to Burzee by daybreak the next morning. "That is not a very long time," said Flossie, "but we are swift and strong, and if we get started by this evening, we can travel many miles during the night." Claus decided to make the attempt, so he hurried on his preparations as fast as possible. After a time, he fastened the collars around the necks of his steeds and harnessed them to his rude sledge. Then he placed a stool on the little platform to serve as a seat, and filled the sack with his prettiest toys. "How do you intend to guide us?" asked Glossy. "We have never been out of the forest before, except to visit your house, so we shall not know the way." Claus thought about that for a moment. Then he brought more cords and fashioned 2 of them to the spreading antlers of each deer, one on the right and the other on the left. "These will be my reins," said Claus, "and when I pull them to the right or the left, you must go in that direction. If I do not pull the reins at all, you may go straight ahead." "Very well," answered Glossy and Flossie, and then they asked, "Are you ready?" Claus seated himself upon the stool, placed the sack of toys at his feet, and then gathered up the reins. "All ready," he shouted. "Away we go!" The deer leaned forward, lifted their slender limbs, and the next moment away flew the sledge over the frozen snow. The swiftness of the motion surprised Claus, for in a few strides they were across the valley and gliding over the broad plain beyond. The day had melted into evening by the time they started, for swiftly as Claus had worked, many hours had been consumed in making his preparations. But the moon shone brightly to light their way, and Claus soon decided it was just as pleasant as to travel by night as by day. The deer liked it better, for although they wished to see something of the world, they were timid about meeting men. And now all the dwellers in the towns and farmhouses were sound asleep and could not see them. Away and away they sped, on and on over the hills and through the valleys and across the plains, until they reached a village where Claus had never been before. Here he called on them to stop, and they immediately obeyed. But a new difficulty now presented itself, for the people had locked their doors when they went to bed, and Claus found he could not enter the houses to leave his toys. "I am afraid, my friends, we have made our journey for nothing," said he, "for I shall be obliged to carry my playthings back home again, without giving them to the children of this village." "What's the matter?" asked Flossie. "The doors are locked," answered Claus, "and I cannot get in." Flossie looked around at the houses. The snow was quite deep in that village, and just before them was a roof only a few feet above the sledge. A broad chimney, which seemed to Glossie big enough to admit Claus, was at the peak of the roof. "Why don't you climb down that chimney?" asked Glossie. Claus looked at it. "That would be easy enough if I were on top of the roof," he answered. "Then hold fast, and we will take you there," said the deer. And they gave one bound to the roof and landed beside the big chimney. "Good!" cried Claus, well pleased, and he slung the pack of toys over his shoulder and got into the chimney. There was plenty of soot on the bricks, but he did not mind that. And by placing his hands and knees against the sides, he crept downward until he reached the fireplace. Leaping lightly over the smoldering coals, he found himself in a large sitting room, where a dim light was burning. From this room, 2 doorways led into smaller chambers. In one, a woman lay asleep, with a baby beside her in a crib. Claus laughed, but he did not laugh aloud, for fear of waking the baby. Then he slipped a big doll from his back and laid it in the crib. The little one smiled, as if it dreamed of the pretty plaything it was to find on the morrow. And Claus crept softly from the room and entered at the other doorway. Here were 2 boys, fast asleep, with their arms around each other's neck. Claus gazed at them lovingly a moment, and then placed upon the bed a drum, 2 horns, and a wooden elephant. He did not linger, now that his work in the house was done, but climbed the chimney again, and seated himself on his sledge. "Can you find another chimney?" he asked the reindeer. "Easily enough," replied Glossie and Flossie. Down to the edge of the roof they raced, and then, without pausing, leaped through the air to the top of the next building, where a huge, old-fashioned chimney stood. "Don't be so long this time," called Flossie, "or we shall never get back to the forest by daybreak." Claus made a trip down this chimney also, and found 5 children sleeping in the house, all of whom were quickly supplied with toys. When he returned, the deer sprang to the next roof, but on descending the chimney, Claus found no children there at all. That was not often the case in this village, however, so he lost less time than you might suppose in visiting the dreary homes where there were no little ones. when he had climbed down the chimneys of all the houses in that village, and had left a toy for every sleeping child, Claus found that his great sack was not yet half emptied. "Onward, friends," he called to the deer. "We must seek another village." So away they dashed, although it was long past midnight, and in a surprisingly short time they came to a large city, the largest Claus had ever visited since he began to make toys. But nothing daunted by the throng of houses, he set to work at once, and his beautiful steeds carried him rapidly from one roof to another, only the highest being beyond the leaps of the idle deer. At last, the supply of toys was exhausted, and Claus seated himself in the sledge, with the empty sack at his feet, and turned the heads of Glossie and Flossie towards home. Presently, Flossie asked, "What is that gray streak in the sky?" "It is the coming of day," answered Claus, surprised to find that it was so late. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Glossie. "Then we shall not be home by daybreak, and the Knooks will punish us, and never let us come again." "We must race for the Laughing Valley, and make our best speed," returned Flossie. "So hold fast, friend Claus." Claus held fast, and the next moment was flying so swiftly over the snow that he could not see the trees as they whirled past. Up hill and down dale, swift as an arrow shot from a bow, they dashed, and Claus shut his eyes to keep the wind out of them, and left the deer to find their own way. It seemed to him they were plunging through space, but he was not at all afraid. The Knooks were severe masters, and must be obeyed at all hazards, and the gray streak in the sky was growing brighter every moment. Finally, the sledge came to a sudden stop, and Claus, who was taken aware, tumbled from his seat into a snowdrift. As he picked himself up, he heard the deer crying, "Quick, friend, quick! Cut away our harness!" He drew his knife and rapidly severed the cords, and then he wiped the moisture from his eyes and looked around him. The sledge had come to a stop in the Laughing Valley, only a few feet, he found, from his own door. In the east the day was breaking, and turning to the edge of Bursey, he saw Glossie and Flossie just disappearing in the forest. That brings us to the end of Chapter 8. So, we've seen the first delivery by sleigh ride of soon-to-be Santa Claus. And cut it to the very limit of the assigned time duration there, coming in with the dawn. Alright, so next up we have Chapter 9, Santa Claus. Well, how timely. Claus thought that none of the children would ever know where the toys came from which they found by their bedsides when they wakened the following morning. But kindly deeds are sure to bring fame, and fame has many wings to carry its tidings into far lands. So, for miles and miles in every direction, people were talking of Claus and his wonderful gifts to children. The sweet generousness of his work caused a few selfish folk to sneer, but even these were forced to admit their respect for a man so gentle-natured that he loved to devote his life to pleasing the helpless little ones of his race. Therefore, the inhabitants of every city and village had been eagerly watching the coming of Claus, and remarkable stories of his beautiful playthings were told the children to keep them patient and contented. When, on the morning following the first trip of Claus with his deer, the little ones came running to their parents with the pretty toys they had found, and asked from whence they came, there was but one reply to the question. "The good Claus must have brought them here, my darlings, for his are the only toys in all the world." "But how did he get in?" asked the children. At this, the fathers shook their heads, being themselves unable to understand how Claus had gained admittance to their homes. But the mothers, watching the glad faces of their dear ones, whispered that the good Claus was no mortal man, but assuredly a saint. And they piously blessed his name for the happiness he had bestowed on their children. "A saint," said one with bowed head, "has no need to unlock doors if it pleases him to enter our homes." And afterward, when a child was naughty or disobedient, its mother would say, "You must pray to the good Santa Claus for forgiveness. He does not like naughty children, and unless you repent, he will bring you no more pretty toys." But Santa Claus himself would not have approved the speech. He brought toys to the children because they were little and helpless, and because he loved them. He knew that the best of children were sometimes naughty, and that the naughty ones were often good. It is the way with children the world over, and he would not have changed their natures had he possessed the power to do so. And that is how our Claus became Santa Claus. It is possible for any man by good deeds to enshrine himself as a saint in the hearts of the people. Brings us to the end of chapter 9. So yes, the advent of Santa Claus. The name is coined and converted as it should be. It felt wrong to just call him Claus earlier, so Claus felt right. But now, it must be as it was meant to be. Alright, Chapter 10, Christmas Eve. The day that broke as Claus returned from his night ride with Glossie and Flossie brought him a new trouble. Will Nook, the chief guardian of the deer, came to him, surly and ill-tempered, to complain that he had kept Flossie and Glossie beyond daybreak, in opposition to his orders. Yet it could not have been very long after daybreak, said Claus. It was 1 minute after, answered Will Nook, and that is as bad as 1 hour. I shall set the stinging gnats on Glossie and Flossie, and they will thus suffer terribly for their disobedience. Don't do that, begged Claus. It was my fault. But Will Nook would listen to no excuses, and went away grumbling and growling in his ill-natured way. For this reason, Claus entered the forest to consult Necile about rescuing the good deer from punishment. To his delight, he found his old friend, the Master Woodsman, seated in the circle of nymphs. Ak listened to the story of the night journey to the children, and of the great assistance the deer had been to Claus by drawing his sledge over the frozen snow. I do not wish my friends to be punished if I can save them, said the toymaker, when he had finished the relation. They were only 1 minute late, and they ran swifter than a bird flies to get home before daybreak. Ak stroked his beard thoughtfully, a moment, and then sent for the Prince of the Nooks, who rules all his people in Burzee, and also for the Queen of the Fairies, and the Prince of the Rills. When all had assembled, Claus told his story again, at Ak's command, and then the Master addressed the Prince of the Nooks, saying, The good work that Claus is doing among mankind deserves the support of every honest immortal. Already he is called a saint in some of the towns, and before long the name of Santa Claus will be lovingly known in every home that is blessed with children. Moreover, he is a son of our forest, so we owe him our encouragement. You, ruler of the Nooks, have known him these many years. Am I not right in saying he deserves our friendship? The prince, crooked and sour of visage as all Nooks are, looked only upon the dead leaves at his feet and muttered, You are the Master Woodsman of the world. Ak smiled but continued in soft tones. It seems that the deer which are guarded by your people can be of great assistance to Claus, and as they seem willing to draw his sledge, I beg that you will permit him to use their services whenever he pleases. The prince did not reply, but tapped the curled point of his sandal with the tip of his spear, as if in thought. Then the Fairy Queen spoke to him in this way. If you consent to Ak's request, I will see that no harm comes to your deer while they are away from the forest. And the Prince of the Rills added, For my part, I will allow to every deer that assists Claus the privilege of eating my casa plants, which give strength, and my grawl plants, which give fleetness of foot, and my marble plants, which give long life. And the Queen of the Nymphs said, The deer which draw the sledge of Claus will be permitted to bathe in the forest pool of Naris, which will give them sleek coats and wonderful beauty. The Prince of the Nooks, hearing these promises, shifted uneasily on his seat, for in his heart he hated to refuse a quest of his fellow immortals, although they were asking an unusual favor at his hands, and the Nooks are unaccustomed to granting favors of any kind. Finally, he turned to his servants and said,
"Call Will Nook."
When surly Will came and heard the demands of the immortals, he protested loudly against granting them.
"Deer on deer," said he, "and nothing but deer. Were they horses, it would be right to harness them like horses, but no one harnesses deer because they are free, wild creatures owing no service of any sort to mankind. It would degrade my deer to labor for Claus, who is only a man in spite of the friendship lavished on him by the immortals." "You have heard," said the prince to Ak. "There is truth in what Will says."
"Call Glossy and Flossie," returned the master. The deer were brought to the conference, and Ak asked them if they objected to drawing the sledge for Claus.
"No, indeed," replied Glossy. "We enjoyed the trip very much." "And we tried to get home by daybreak," added Flossie, "but we're unfortunately a minute too late."
A minute lost at daybreak doesn't matter," said Ak. "You are forgiven for that delay."
"Provided it does not happen again,"
said the Prince of the Nooks sternly.
"And you will permit them to make another journey with me?" asked Claus eagerly.
The prince reflected while he gazed at Will, who was scowling, and the master woodman, who was smiling. Then he stood up and addressed the company as follows.
"Since you all urge me to grant the favor, I will permit the deer to go with Claus once every year on Christmas Eve, provided they always return to the forest by daybreak. He may select any number he pleases, up to 10, to draw his sledge, and those shall be known among us as reindeer, to distinguish them from the others. And they shall bathe in the pool of Naris, and eat the kassa and groll and modern plants, and shall be under the especial protection of the fairy queen. And now cease scowling, Will Nook, for my word shall be obeyed."
He hobbled quickly away through the trees, to avoid the thanks of Claus and the approval of the other immortals, and Will, looking as cross as ever, followed him. But Ak was satisfied, knowing that he could rely on the promise of the prince, however grudgingly given, and Glossy and Flossie ran home, kicking up their heels delightedly at every step. "When is Christmas Eve?" Claus asked the master. "In about 10 days, he replied.
"Then I cannot use the deer this year," said Claus thoughtfully, "for I shall not have time enough to make my sack full of toys."
"The shrewd prince foresaw that," responded Ak, "and therefore named Christmas Eve as the day you might use the deer, knowing it would cause you to lose an entire year."
"If only I had the toys the Agua stole from me," said Claus sadly, "I could easily fill my sack for the children."
"Where are they?" asked the master.
"I do not know," replied Claus, "but the wicked Aguas probably hid them in the mountains."
Ak turned to the fairy queen. "Can you find them?" he asked.
"I will try,"
she replied brightly. Then Claus went back to the Laughing Valley to work as hard as he could, and a band of fairies immediately flew to the mountain that had been haunted by the Aguas and began a search for the stolen toys. The fairies, as we well know, possess wonderful powers, but the cunning Aguas had hidden the toys in a deep cave and covered the opening with rocks, so no one could look in. Therefore, all search for the missing playthings proved in vain for several days, and Claus, who sat at home waiting for news from the fairies, almost despaired of getting the toys before Christmas Eve. He worked hard every moment, but it took considerable time to carve out and to shape each toy and to paint it properly, so that on the morning before Christmas Eve, only half of one small shelf above the window was filled with playthings ready for the children. But on this morning, the fairies who were searching the mountain had a new thought. They joined hands and moved in a straight line through the rocks that formed the mountain, beginning at the topmost peak and working downward, so that no spot could be missed by their bright eyes. And at last, they discovered the cave where the toys had been heaped up by the wicked Aguas. It did not take them long to burst open the mouth of the cave, and then each one seized as many toys as he could carry, and they all flew to Claus and laid the treasure before him. The good man was rejoiced to receive, just in the nick of time, such a store of playthings with which to load his sledge. And he sent word to Glossy and Flossie to be ready for the journey at nightfall. With all his other labors, he had managed to find time, since the last trip,
to repair the harness and to straighten his sledge, so that when the deer came to him at twilight, he had no difficulty in harnessing them. "We must go in another direction tonight," he told them, "where we shall find children I have never yet visited. And we must travel fast and work quickly, for my sack is full of toys and running over the brim." So, just as the moon arose, they dashed out of the Laughing Valley and across the plain and over the hills to the south. The air was sharp and frosty. The starlight touched the snowflakes and made them glitter like countless diamonds. The reindeer leaped onward with strong, steady bounds, and Klaus's heart was so light and merry that he laughed and sang while the wind whistled past his ears, with a ho-ho-ho and a ha-ha-ha and a ho-ho-ha-ha-hee, and away we go over the frozen snow as merry as we can be. Jack Frost heard him and came racing up with his nippers, but when he saw it was Klaus, he laughed and turned away again. The mother owls heard him, and he passed near a wood and stuck their heads out of the hollow places in the tree trunks. But when they saw who it was, they whispered to the owlets nestling near them that it was only Santa Claus, carrying toys to the children. It is strange how much those mother owls know. Klaus stopped at some of the scattered farmhouses and climbed down the chimneys to leave presents for the babies. Soon after, he reached a village and worked merrily for an hour, distributing playthings among the sleeping little ones. Then away again he went, singing his joyous carol, "Now away we go o'er the gleaming snow, while the deer run swift and free. For to girls and boys we carry the toys that will fill their hearts with glee." The deer liked the sound of his deep bass voice, and kept time to the song with their hoofbeats on the hard snow. Soon they stopped at another chimney, and Santa Claus, with sparkling eyes and face brushed red by the wind, climbed down its smoky sides and left a present for every child the house contained. It was a merry, happy night. Swiftly the deer ran, and busily their driver worked to scatter his gifts among the sleeping children. But the sack was empty at last, and the sledge headed homeward, and now again the race with daybreak began. Glossie and Flossie had no mind to be rebuked a second time for tardiness, so they fled with a swiftness that enabled them to pass the gale on which the Frost King rode, and soon brought them to the Laughing Valley. It is true, when Klaus released his steeds from their harness, the eastern sky was streaked with gray, but Glossie and Flossie were deep in the forest before day fairly broke. Klaus was so wearied with the night's work that he threw himself upon his bed and fell into a deep slumber. And while he slept, the Christmas sun appeared in the sky and shone upon hundreds of happy homes, where the sound of childish laughter proclaimed that Santa Claus had made them a visit. God bless him. It was his first Christmas Eve, and for hundreds of years since then, he has nobly fulfilled his mission to bring happiness to the hearts of little children. That brings us to the end of chapter 10. So we see the first Christmas Eve deliveries, the first run with the reindeer, as they are now properly known, not just deer, but reindeer. And yes, a slight fumbling brought bass to bass. It happens. And it happened while we were in a little bit of a verse. So you will be forgiven for thinking of the singing Billy Bass. All right. Let's try and get through one more chapter tonight, or before we take a break for tonight. We're nearing about the 3/4 mark, so we're at a good pace. So, chapter 11, how the first stockings were hung by the chimneys. When you remember that no child, until Santa Claus began his travels, had ever known the pleasure of possessing a toy, you will understand how joy crept into the homes of those who had been favored with a visit from the good man, and how they talked of him day by day in loving tones, and were honestly grateful for his kindly deeds. It is true that great warriors and mighty kings and clever scholars of that day were often spoken of by the people, but no one of them was so greatly beloved
as Santa Claus, because none other was so unselfish as to devote himself to making others happy. For a generous deed lives longer than a great battle or a king's decree or a scholar's essay, because it spreads and leaves its mark on all nature and endures through many generations. The bargain made with the Nook Prince changed the plans of Claus for all future time, for, being able to use the reindeer on but one night each year, he decided to devote all the other days to the manufacture of playthings, and on Christmas Eve to carry them to the children of the world. But a year's work, he knew, would result in a vast accumulation of toys, so he resolved to build a new sledge that would be larger and stronger and better fitted for swift travel than the old and clumsy one. His first act was to visit the Gnome King, with whom he had made a bargain to exchange 3 drums, a trumpet, and 2 dolls for a pair of fine steel runners, curled beautifully at the ends. For the Gnome King had children of his own, who, living in the hollows under the earth in mines and caverns, needed something to amuse them. In 3 days, the steel runners were ready, and when Claus brought the playthings to the Gnome King, His Majesty was so greatly pleased with them that he presented Claus with a string of sweet-toned sleigh bells, in addition to the runners. "These will greatly please Glossy and Flossie," said Claus as he jingled the bells, and listened to their merry sound. "But I should have 2 strings of bells, one for each deer." "Bring me another trumpet and a toy cap," replied the king, "and you shall have a 2nd string of bells like the first." "It's a bargain!" cried Claus, and he went home again for the toys. The new sledge was carefully built, the Knooks bringing plenty of strong but thin boards to use in its construction. Claus made a high, rounding dashboard to keep off the snow cast behind by the fleet hoofs of the deer, and he made high sides to the platform so that many toys could be carried. And finally, he mounted the sledge upon the slender steel runners made by the Gnome King. It certainly was a handsome sledge, and big and roomy. Claus painted it in bright colors, although no one was likely to see it during his midnight journeys. And when all was finished, he sent for Glossy and Flossie to come and look at it. The deer admired the sledge, but gravely declared it was too big and heavy for them to draw. "We might pull it over the snow, to be sure," said Glossy, "but we would not pull it fast enough to enable us to visit the faraway cities and villages and return to the forest by daybreak." "Then I must add 2 more deer to my team," declared Claus after a moment's thought. "The Nook Prince allowed you as many as 10? Why not use them all?" asked Flossie. "Then we could speed like the lightning and leap to the highest roofs with ease." "A team of 10 reindeer!" cried Claus delightedly. "That will be splendid! Please, return to the forest at once, and select 8 other deer as like yourselves as possible. And you must all eat of the Casa plant to become strong, and the Grawl plant to become fleet of foot, and of the Marbon plant, that you may live long to accompany me on my journeys. Likewise, it will be well for you to bathe in the pool of Narles, which the lovely Queen Zerline declares will render you rarely beautiful. Should you perform these duties faithfully, there is no doubt that on next Christmas Eve my 10 reindeer will be the most powerful and beautiful steeds the world has ever seen." So Glossy and Flossie went to the forest to choose their mates, and Claus began to consider the question of a harness for them all. In the end, he called upon Peter Nook for assistance, for Peter's heart is as kind as his body is crooked, and he is remarkably shrewd as well. And Peter agreed to furnish strips of tough leather for the harness. This leather was cut from the skins of lions that had reached such an advanced age that they died naturally, and on one side was tawny hair, while the other side was cured to the softness of velvet by the deft Nooks. When Claus received these strips of leather, he sewed them neatly into a harness for the 10 reindeer, and it proved strong and serviceable, and lasted him for many years. The harness and sledge were prepared at odd times, for Claus devoted most of his days to the making toys. These were now much better than the first ones had been, for the immortals often came to his house to watch him work and to offer suggestions. It was Nasile's idea to make some of the dolls say Papa and Mama. It was a thought of the Nooks to put a squeak inside the lambs, so that when a child squeezed them, they would say Ba! And the Fairy Queen advised Claus to put whistles in the birds, so they could be made to sing, and wheels on the horses, so children could draw them around. Many animals perished in the forest, from one cause or another, and their fur was brought to Claus, that he might cover with it the small images of beasts he made for playthings. A merry rill suggested that Claus make a donkey with a nodding head, which he did, and afterward found that it amused the little ones immensely. Though the toys grew in beauty and attractiveness every day, until they were the wonder of even the immortals. When another Christmas Eve drew near, there was a monster load of beautiful gifts for the children ready to be loaded upon the big sledge. Claus filled 3 sacks to the brim and tucked every corner of the sledge box full of toys besides. Then at twilight, the 10 reindeer appeared, and Flossie introduced them all to Claus. They were Racer and Pacer, Reckless and Speckless, Fearless and Peerless, Ready and Steady, who, with Glossie and Flossie, made up the 10 who have traversed the world these hundreds of years with their generous master. They were all exceedingly beautiful, with slender limbs, spreading antlers, velvety dark eyes, smooth coats of fawn color spotted with white. Baum's taken some liberties with the names here. That or he predates the names that we might be a little bit more familiar with. It could be. Either way. Claus loved them at once, and has loved them ever since, for they are loyal friends who have rendered him priceless service. The new harness fitted them nicely, and soon they were all fastened to the sledge by twos, with Glossie and Flossie in the lead. These wore the strings of sleigh bells, and were so delighted with the music they made that they kept prancing up and down to make the bells ring. Claus now seated himself in the sledge, drew a warm robe over his knees and his fur cap over his eyes, and cracked his long whip as a signal to start. Instantly, the 10 leaped forward and were away like the wind, while jolly Claus laughed gleefully to see them run and shouted a song in his big, hearty voice. With a ho-ho-ho and a ha-ha-ha and a ho-ho-ha-ha-hee, now away we go o'er the frozen snow, as merry as we can be. There are many joys in our load of toys, and as many a child will know. We'll scatter them wide on our wild night ride, o'er the crisp and sparkling snow. Now, it was on this same Christmas Eve that little Margot and her brother Dick and her cousins Ned and Sarah, who were visiting at Margot's house, came in from making a snowman, with their clothes damp, their mittens dripping, and their shoes and stockings wet through and through. They were not scolded, for Margot's mother knew the snow was melting, but they were sent early to bed, that their clothes might be hung over chairs to dry. The shoes were placed on the red tiles of the hearth, where the heat from the hot embers would strike them, and the stockings were carefully hung in a row by the chimney, directly over the fireplace. That was the reason Santa Claus noticed them when he came down the chimney, and that night, and all the household were fast asleep. He was in a tremendous hurry, and seeing the stockings all belonged to children, he quickly stuffed his toys into them and dashed up the chimney again, appearing on the roof so suddenly that the reindeer were astonished at his agility. I wish they would all hang up their stockings, he thought, as he drove to the next chimney. It would save me a lot of time, and I could then visit more children before daybreak. When Margot and Dick and Ned and Sarah jumped out of bed the next morning and ran downstairs to get their stockings from the fireplace, they were filled with delight to find the toys from Santa Claus inside them. In fact, I think they found more presents in their stockings than any other children of that city had received, for Santa Claus was in a hurry and did not stop to count the toys. Of course, they told all their little friends about it, and of course, every one of them decided to hang his own stockings by the fireplace the next Christmas Eve. Even Betsy Blithesome, who made a visit to that city with her father, the great Lord of Lurd, heard the story from the children and hung her own pretty stockings by the chimney when she returned home at Christmas time. On his next trip, Santa Claus found so many stockings hung up in anticipation of his visit that he could fill them in a jiffy and be away again in half the time required to hunt the children up and place the toys by their bedsides. The custom grew year after year and has always been a great help to Santa Claus. And with so many children to visit, he surely needs all the help we are able to give him. That brings us to the end of chapter 11. So, all of the bits and pieces of Santa's lore that we're more familiar with are coming into place now. All the pieces are coming together. The dashing through the snow, the reindeer pulling the sleigh. Dunder and Blixen. Okay. So, there's been a few changes over the years of who what the reindeers' names are. Understandable. It's been a while. Dutch for Thunder and Lightning. That makes sense. Okay. I believe it. So, alright. But yeah, so we're starting to see all of the familiar parts of Santa that we know from other media coming into being, and presumably, whether or not this is accepted as the definitive Santa lore is up to anyone and their own interpretations, but for me, this fits pretty well of how things came to be. So, let's go ahead and take a few minutes, top up our drinks, freshen up the tea, stretch our legs, and we'll see if, that's true, our modern Santa is invented by Coca-Cola, so liberties are afforded to authors and marketing departments, apparently. Not sure how I feel about that one. Anyway, we'll be back in just a few minutes, and we'll return to reach the end of the life and adventures of Santa Claus. Actually, I don't like how that sounds, a little ominous. The end of this story. Alright, be back in just a little bit, guys. All right, we are back. Just rearrange the blankets. I'm keeping it rather cold in here. All right. So, we are making very steady progress. We have a little bit less than a quarter of the book left, and we have a little bit less than an hour left. So, I do think we can reach the end of this story tonight. So let's get back into it, because we've seen the delivery of the toys, we've seen the sleigh, we've seen the reindeer, we've seen the stockings. But and we've seen why Christmas Eve became the night of the deliveries. But there's a little bit more to come through in this story before we really see Santa as we know him. And remember, he's just a man at this point. So, there's a lot of little pieces still to fall into place. So we have now Chapter 12, The First Christmas Tree. Claus had always kept his promise to the Knooks by returning to the Laughing Valley by daybreak, but only the swiftness of his reindeer had enabled him to do this, for he travels over all the world. He loved his work, and he loved the brisk night ride on his sledge and the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells. On that first trip with the 10 reindeer, only Glossy and Flossie wore bells. But each year thereafter, for 8 years, Claus carried presents to the children of the Gnome King, and that good-natured monarch gave him in return a string of bells at each visit. So finally every one of the 10 deer was supplied. And you may imagine what a merry tune the bells played as the sledge sped over the snow. The children's stockings were so long that it required a great many toys to fill them, and soon Claus found that there were other things besides toys that children love. So he sent some of the fairies, who were always his good friends, into the tropics, from whence they returned with great bags full of oranges and bananas, which they had plucked from the trees. And other fairies flew to the wonderful Valley of Funnyland, where delicious candies and bonbons grew thickly on the bushes. Is that how candies and bonbons are made? I see. And returned laden with many boxes of sweetmeats for the little ones. These things Santa Claus, on each Christmas Eve, placed in the long stockings, together with his toys, and the children were glad to get them, you may be sure. There are also warm countries, where there is no snow in winter, but Claus and his reindeer visited them as well as the colder climes, for there were little wheels inside the runners of his sledge, which permitted it to run as smoothly over bare ground as on the snow. And the children who lived in the warm countries learned to know the name of Santa Claus as well as those who lived nearer to the Laughing Valley. Once, just as the reindeer were ready to start on their yearly trip, a fairy came to Claus and told him of 3 little children who lived beneath a rude tent of skins on a broad plain where there were no trees whatever. These poor babies were miserable and unhappy, for their parents were ignorant people who neglected them sadly. Claus resolved to visit these 3 children before he returned home, and during his ride he picked up the bushy top of a pine tree, which the wind had broken off, and placed it in his sledge. It was nearly morning when the deer stopped before the lonely tent of skins, where the poor children lay asleep. Claus at once planted the bit of pine tree in the sand and stuck many candles on the branches. Then he hung some of his prettiest toys on the tree, as well as several bags of candies. It did not take long to do all this, for Santa Claus works quickly, and when all was ready, he lighted the candles, and thrusting his head in at the opening of the tent, he shouted, "Merry Christmas, little ones!" That's a good way to surprise the children. With that, he leaped into his sledge and was out of sight before the children, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, could come out to see who had called them. You can imagine the wonder and joy of those little ones, who had never in their lives known a real pleasure before, when they saw the tree, sparkling with lights that shone brilliant in the gray dawn and hung with toys enough to make them happy for years to come. They joined hands and danced around the tree, shouting and laughing until they were obliged to pause for breath. And their parents also came out to look and wonder, and thereafter had more respect and consideration for their children, since Santa Claus had honored them with such brilliant, beautiful gifts. The idea of the Christmas tree pleased Claus, and so the following year he carried many of them in his sledge and set them up in the homes of poor people who seldom saw trees, and placed candles and toys on the branches. Of course, he could not carry enough trees in one load of all who wanted them, but in some homes, the fathers were able to get trees and have them all ready for Santa Claus when he arrived, and these the good Claus always decorated as prettily as possible, and hung with toys enough for all the children who came to see the tree lighted. These novel ideas, and the generous manner in which they were carried out, made the children long for that one night in the year when their friend Santa Claus should visit them. And as such anticipation is very pleasant and comforting, the little ones gleaned much happiness by wondering what would happen when Santa Claus next arrived. Perhaps you may remember that stern Baron Braun, who once drove Claus from his castle and forbade him to visit his children. Well, many years afterward, when the old Baron was dead and his son ruled in his place, the new Baron Braun came to the house of Claus with his train of knights and pages and henchmen, and, dismounting from his charger, bared his head humbly before the friend of the children. "My father did not know your goodness and worth," he said, "and therefore threatened to hang you from the castle walls. But I have children of my own, who long for a visit from Santa Claus, and I have come to beg that you will favor them hereafter as you do other children." Claus was pleased with this speech, for Castle Braun was the only place he had never visited, and he gladly promised to bring presents to the Baron's children the next Christmas Eve. The Baron went away contented, and Claus kept his promise faithfully. Thus did this man, through very goodness, conquer the hearts of all. And it is no wonder he was ever merry and gay, for there was no home in the wide world where he was not welcomed more royally than any king. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of the life and adventures of Santa Claus. So all the traditions are set, the ideas and familiar tropes and the Christmas spirit, as we think, is all laid out. The how, the why, the wherefore. Santa's doing his work. But now we leave Santa's adulthood and come to part 3, old age. Remember, all through this, Santa was basically a young man. Alright, chapter 1, The Mantle of Immortality. Let's jumping the shark a little there. And now we come to a turning point in the career of Santa Claus. It is my duty to relate the most remarkable that has happened since the world began or mankind was created. We have followed the life of Claus from the time he was found a helpless infant by the wood nymph Necile and reared to manhood in the great forest of Bluesky. And we know how he began to make toys for children, and how, with the assistance and goodwill of the immortals, he was able to distribute them to the little ones throughout the world. For many years, he carried on this noble work, for the simple, hard-working life he led gave him perfect health and strength. And doubtless, a man can live longer in the beautiful Laughing Valley, where there are no cares and everything is peaceful and merry, than in any other part of the world. But when many years had rolled away, Santa Claus grew old. The long beard of golden brown that once covered his cheeks and chin gradually became gray, and finally turned to pure white. His hair was white too, and there were wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, which showed plainly when he laughed. He had never been a very tall man, and now he became fat and waddled very much like a duck when he walked. But in spite of these things, he remained as lively as ever, and was just as jolly and gay. and his kind eyes sparkled as brightly as they did that first day when he came to the Laughing Valley. Yet, a time is sure to come when every mortal who has grown old and lived his life is required to leave this world for another. So it is no wonder that, after Santa Claus had driven his reindeer on many and many a Christmas Eve, those staunch friends finally whispered among themselves that they had probably drawn his sledge for the last time. Then, all of the forest of Bluesky became sad, and the Laughing Valley was hushed, for every living thing that had known Claus had used to love him, and to brighten at the sound of his footsteps or the notes of his merry whistle. No doubt the old man's strength was at last exhausted, for he made no more toys, and lay on his bed as in a dream. The nymph Necile, she who had reared him and had been his foster mother, was still youthful and strong and beautiful, and it seemed to her but a short time since this aged, gray-bearded man had laid in her arms and smiled on her with his innocent baby lips. In this is shown the difference between mortals and immortals. It was fortunate that the great Ak came to the forest at this time. Necile sought him with troubled eyes and told him of the fate that threatened their friend Claus. At once the master became grave, and he leaned upon his axe and stroked his grizzled beard thoughtfully for many minutes. Then suddenly he stood up straight and poised his powerful head with firm resolve, and stretched out his great right arm as if determined on doing some mighty deed. For a thought had come to him so grand in its conception that all the world might well bow before the master woodsman and honor his name forever. It is well known that when the great Ak once undertakes to do a thing, he never hesitates an instant. Now he summoned his fleetest messengers and sent them in a flash to many parts of the earth. And when they were gone, he turned to the anxious Necile and comforted her, saying, "Be of good heart, my child. Our friend still lives. And now run to your queen, and tell her that I have summoned a council of all the immortals of the world to meet with me here in Bluesky this night. If they obey and hearken unto my words, Claus will drive his reindeer for countless ages yet to come." At midnight, there was a wondrous scene in the ancient forest of Bluesky, where, for the first time in many centuries, the rulers of the immortals who inhabit the earth were gathered together. There was the queen of the water sprites, whose beautiful form was as clear as crystal, but continually dripped water on the bank of moss where she sat. And beside her was the king of the sleep fays, who carried a wand from the end of which a fine dust fell all around, so that no mortal could keep awake long enough to see him, as mortal eyes were sure to close in sleep as soon as the dust filled them. And next to him sat the gnome king, whose people inhabit all that region under the earth's surface, where they guard the precious metals and the jewel stones that lie buried in rock and ore. At his right hand stood the king of the sound imps, who had wings on his feet, for his people are swift to carry all sounds that are made. When they are busy, they carry the sounds but short distances, for there are many of them. But sometimes they speed with the sounds to places miles and miles away from where they are made. The king of the sound imps had an anxious and careworn face, for most people have no consideration for his imps, and, especially the boys and girls, make a great many unnecessary sounds, which the imps are obliged to carry when they might be better employed. That's an image. Pissing off the king of the imps because, you're noisy children. That's The next in the circle of immortals was the king of the wind demons, slender of frame, restless and uneasy at being confined to one place for even an hour. Once in a while he would leave his place and circle around the glade, and each time he did this the fairy queen was obliged to untangle the flowing locks of her golden hair and tuck them back of her pink ears. But she did not complain, for it was not often that the king of the wind demons came into the heart of the forest. After the fairy queen, whose home you know was in Old Burzee, came the king of the light elves, and his two princes, Flash and Twilight, at his back. He never went anywhere without his princes, for they were so mischievous that he dared not let them wander alone. Before Flash, Prince Flash bore a lightning bolt in his right hand and a horn of gunpowder in his left, and his bright eyes roved constantly around, as if he longed to use his blinding flashes. Prince Twilight held a great snuffer in one hand and a big black cloak in the other, and it is well known that unless Twilight is carefully watched, the snuffers or the cloak will throw everything into darkness, and darkness is the greatest enemy of the King of the Light Elves has. In addition to the immortals I have named, were the King of the Nooks, who had come from his home in the jungles of India, and the King of the Rills, who lived among the gay flowers and luscious fruits of Valencia. Sweet Queen Zerline of the Wood Nymphs completed the circle of immortals. But in the center of the circle sat three others, who possessed powers so great that all the kings and queens showed them reverence. These were Ak, the master woodsman of the world, who rules the forests, and the orchards and the groves, and Kern, the master husbandman of the world, who rules the grain fields, and the meadows, and the gardens, and Bo, the master mariner of the world, who rules the seas, and all the craft that float thereon, and all other immortals are, more or less, subject to these three. When all had assembled, the master woodsman of the world stood up to address them, since he himself had summoned them to the council. Very clearly, he told them the story of Claus, beginning at the time when, as a babe, he had been adopted a child of the forest, and telling of his noble and generous nature, and his lifelong labors to make children happy. "And now," said Ak, "when he had won the love of all the world, the spirit of death is hovering over him. Of all men who have inhabited the earth, none other so well deserves immortality. For such a life cannot be spared so long as there are children of mankind to miss him and to grieve over his loss. We immortals are the servants of the world, and to serve the world we were permitted in the beginning to exist. But what one of us is more worthy of immortality than this man Claus, who so sweetly ministers to the little children?" He paused, and glanced around the circle, to find every immortal listening to him eagerly, and nodding approval. Finally, the king of the wind demons, who had been whistling softly to himself, cried out, "What is your desire, O Ak?" "To bestow upon Claus the mantle of immortality," said Ak boldly. That this demand was wholly unexpected was proved by the immortals springing to their feet and looking into each other's face with dismay, and then upon Ak with wonder, for it was a grave matter, this parting with the mantle of immortality. The Queen of the Water Sprites spoke in her low, clear voice, and the words sounded like raindrops splashing upon a window pane. "In all the world there is but one mantle of immortality," she said. The King of the Sound Phase added, "It has existed since the beginning, and no mortal has ever dared to claim it." And the Master Mariner of the world arose and stretched his limbs, saying, "Only by the vote of every immortal can it be bestowed upon a mortal." "I know all this," answered Ak quietly, "but the mantle exists, and if it was created, as you say in the beginning, it was because the Supreme Master knew that someday it would be required. Until now, no mortal has deserved it. But who among you dares deny that the good Claus deserves it? Will you not all vote to bestow it upon him?" They were silent, still looking upon one another questioningly. "Of what use is the mantle of immortality unless it is worn?" demanded Ak. "What will it profit any one of us to allow it to remain in its lonely shrine for all time to come?"
"Enough!"
cried the Gnome King abruptly.
We will vote on the matter. Yes or no? For my part, I say yes.
And I, said the Fairy Queen promptly, and Ack rewarded her with a smile. My people in Berzy tell me they've learned to love him. Therefore I vote to give Claus the mantle, said the King of the Rills.
He is already a comrade of the Nooks,
announced the ancient king of that band.
Let him have immortality.
Let him have it, let him have it, sighed the King of the Wind Demons. Why not? asked the King of the Sleep Phase. He never disturbs the slumber of my people. My people allow humanity. Let the good Claus be immortal. I do not object, said the King of the Sound Imps. Nor I, murmured the Queen of the Water Sprites. If Claus does not receive the mantle, it is clear none other can ever claim it, remarked the King of the Light Elves. So, let us have done with the thing for all time. The wood nymphs were the first to adopt him, said Queen Zerlene. Of course, I shall vote to make him immortal. Ack now turned to the master husbandman of the world, who held up his right arm and said, Yes! And the master baron of the world did likewise. After which, Ack, with sparkling eyes and smiling face, cried out, I thank you, fellow mortals, for all have voted yes, and so, to our dear Claus, shall fall the one mantle of immortality that it is in our power to bestow. Let us fetch it at once, said the Fey King. I am in a hurry. They bowed assent, and instantly the forest glade was deserted. But, in a place midway between the earth and the sky was suspended a gleaming crypt of gold and platinum, aglow with soft lights shed from the facets of countless gems. Within a high dome hung the precious mantle of immortality, and each immortal placed a hand on the hem of the splendid robe, and said, as with one voice, We bestow this mantle upon Claus, who is called the patron saint of children. At this, the mantle came away from its lofty crypt, and they carried it to the house in the Laughing Valley. The spirit of death was crouching very near to the bedside of Claus, and as the immortals approached, she sprang up and motioned them back with an angry gesture. But when her eyes fell upon the mantle they bore, she shrank away with a low moan of disappointment, and quitted that house forever. Softly and silently, the immortal band dropped upon Claus the precious mantle, and it closed about him and sank into the outlines of his body and disappeared from view. It became a part of his being, and neither mortal nor immortal might ever take it from him. Then kings and queens who had wrought this great deed dispersed to their various homes, and all were well contented that they had added another immortal to their band. And Claus slept on, the red blood of everlasting life coursing swiftly through his veins, and on his brow was a tiny drop of water that had fallen from the ever-melting gown of the Queen of the Water Sprites, and over his lips hovered a tender kiss that had been left by the sweet nymph Necile, for she had stolen in when the others were gone to gaze with rapture upon the immortal form of her foster son. That is the end of chapter 1 of the third part of the story. So, things escalated quickly and were just as quickly resolved. And I will, for one, say I am very grateful that the Council of the Immortals was over with equally quickly. That was a lot of voices to pull out of nowhere. Alright, Chapter 2. When the World Grew Old. The next morning, when Santa Claus opened his eyes and gazed around the familiar room, which he had feared he might never see again, he was astonished to find his old strength renewed, and to feel the red blood of perfect health coursing through his veins. He sprang from his bed and stood where the bright sunshine came in through the window, and flooded him with its merry dancing rays. He did not then understand what had happened to restore him to the vigor of youth. But in spite of the fact that his beard remained the color of snow, and that wrinkles still lingered at the corners of his bright eyes, old Santa Claus felt as brisk and merry as a boy of 16, and soon was whistling contentedly as he busied himself fashioning new toys. Then Ak came to him and told of the mantle of immortality, and how Claus had won it through his love for little children. It made old Santa look grave for a moment to think he had been so favored, but it also made him glad to realize that now he need never fear being parted from his dear ones. At once he began preparations for making a remarkable assortment of pretty and amusing playthings, and in larger quantities than ever before. For now that he might always devote himself to his work, he decided that no child in the world, poor or rich, should hereafter go without a Christmas gift if he could manage to supply it. The world was new in the days when dear old Santa Claus first began toy-making and won, by his loving deeds, the mantle of immortality. And the task of supplying cheering words, sympathy, and pretty playthings to all the young of his race did not seem a difficult undertaking at all. But every year, more and more children were born into the world. And these, when they grew up, began spreading slowly over all the face of the earth, seeking new homes, so that Santa Claus found each year that his journeys must extend farther and farther from the Laughing Valley, and that the packs of toys must be made larger and ever larger. So, at length, he took counsel with his fellow immortals, how his work might keep pace with the increasing number of children, that none might be neglected. And the immortals were so greatly interested in his labors that they gladly rendered him their assistance. Ak gave him his man Kilter, the silent and swift, and the Nook Prince gave him Peter, who was more crooked and less surly than any of his brothers. And the Rill Prince gave him Nuter, the sweetest tempered rill ever known, and the Fairy Queen gave him Whisk, that tiny, mischievous, but lovable fairy, who knows, today, almost as many children as does Santa Claus himself. With these people to help make the toys, and to keep his house in order, and to look after the sledge and the harness, Santa Claus found it much easier to prepare his yearly load of gifts, and his days began to follow one another smoothly and pleasantly. Yet, after a few generations, his worries were renewed, and it was remarkable how the number of people continued to grow, and how many more children there were every year to be served. When all the people filled all the cities and lands of one country, they wandered into another part of the world, and the men cut down the trees in many of the great forests that had been ruled by Ak, and with the wood they built new cities, and where the forests had been were fields of grain and herds of browsing cattle. You might think that the Master Woodsman would rebel at the loss of his forests, but not so. The wisdom of Ak was mighty and far-seeing. "The world was made for men," said he to Santa Claus, "and I have but guarded the forests until men needed them for their use. I am glad my strong trees can furnish shelter for men's weak bodies, and warm them through the cold winters. But I hope they will not cut down all the trees, for mankind needs the shelter of the woods in summer as much as the warmth of blazing logs in winter. And, however crowded the world may grow, I do not think men will ever come to Burzee, nor to the great Black Forest, nor to the wooded wilderness of Braz, unless they seek their shades for pleasure, and not to destroy their giant trees." Very optimistic of Ak, but we'll leave that be for now. By and by, people made ships from tree trunks, and crossed over oceans and built cities in far lands. But the oceans made little difference to the journeys of Santa Claus. His reindeer sped over the waters as swiftly as over land. His sledge headed from east to west and followed in the wake of the sun, so that as the earth rolled slowly over, Santa Claus had all of 24 hours to encircle it each Christmas Eve. And the speedy reindeer enjoyed these wonderful journeys more and more. So, year after year, and generation after generation, century after century, the world grew older, and the people became more numerous, and the labors of Santa Claus steadily increased. The fame of his good deeds spread to every household where children dwelt, and all the little ones loved him dearly, and the fathers and the mothers honored him for the happiness he had given them when they too were young, and the aged grandsires and granddames remembered him with tender gratitude and blessed his name. Yeah, that's fair. Optimism in a Santa story is to be forgiven. To be expected, even. Alright, and that is the end of Chapter 2 of Part 3, wherein Ack gives a little bit of a conservationist and realist perspective. The lands and the world are there for the use, but it would be nice for them not to be overused. Responsible caretaking is the way of it. Alright, we have, I think, we're coming very near to the end here, if I recall. Yeah, actually, by very near to the end, I mean, this is the last chapter. Chapter 3, The Deputies of Santa Claus. We've made very much faster progress tonight than we did in the first night. That or I'm just misremembering or misestimating how much is left at the end. Because it says 87%, so it'll probably end around 93, 94. However, there was one evil following in the path of civilization that caused Santa Claus a vast amount of trouble before he discovered a way to overcome it. But fortunately, it was the last trial he was forced to undergo. One Christmas Eve, when his reindeer had leaped to the top of a new building, Santa Claus was surprised to find that the chimney had been built much smaller than usual. But he had no time to think about it just then, so he drew in his breath and made himself as small as possible and slid down the chimney. I ought to be at the bottom by this time, he thought, as he continued to slip downward. But no fireplace of any sort met his view, and by, he reached the very end of the chimney, which was in the cellar. This is odd, he reflected, much puzzled by this experience. If there is no fireplace, what on earth is the chimney good for? Then he began to climb out again and found it hard work, the space being so small. And on his way up, he noticed a thin, round pipe sticking through the side of the chimney, and could not guess what it was for. Finally, he reached the roof and said to the reindeer, "There was no need of my going down that chimney, for I could find no fireplace through which to enter the house. I fear the children who live there must go without playthings this Christmas." Then he drove on, but soon came to another new house with a small chimney. This caused Santa Claus to shake his head doubtfully, but he tried the chimney nevertheless, and found it exactly like the other. Moreover, he nearly stuck fast in the narrow flue and tore his jacket trying to get out again. So, although he came to several such chimneys that night, he did not venture to descend any more of them. "What in the world are people thinking of, to build such useless chimneys?" he exclaimed. "In all the years I have traveled with my reindeer, I have never seen the like before." True enough, but Santa Claus had not then discovered that stoves had been invented and were fast coming into use. When he did find out, he wondered how the builders of those houses could have so little consideration for him, when they knew very well it was his custom to climb down chimneys and enter houses by way of the fireplaces. Perhaps the men who built those houses had outgrown their own love for toys, and were indifferent whether Santa Claus called on their children or not. Whatever the explanation might be, the poor children were forced to bear the burden of grief and disappointment. The following year, Santa Claus found more and more of the new-fashioned chimneys that had no fireplaces. And the next year, still more. The third year, so numerous had the narrow chimneys become, he even had a few toys left in his sledge that he was unable to give away, because he could not get to the children. The matter became now so serious that it worried the good man greatly, and he decided to talk it over with Kilter, and Peter, and Nuta, and Whisk. Kilter already knew something about it, for it had been his duty to run around to all the houses just before Christmas and gather up the notes and letters to Santa Claus that the children had written, telling what they wished put in their stocking or hung on their Christmas trees. But Kilter was a silent fellow, and seldom spoke of what he saw in the cities and villages. The others were very indignant.
Those people act as if they do not wish their children to be made happy, said sensible Peter in a vexed tone. The idea of shutting out such a generous friend to their little ones.
But it is my intention to make children happy, whether their parents wish it or not, returned Santa Claus. Years ago, when I first began making toys, children were even more neglected by their parents than they are now. So, I have learned to pay no attention to thoughtless or selfish parents, but to consider only the longings of childhood.
You are right, my master, said Nuta the Rill. Many children would lack a friend if you did not consider them and try to make them happy. Then, declared the laughing Whisk, we must abandon any thought of using these new-fashioned chimneys, but become burglars and break into the houses some other way.
What way? Asked Santa Claus.
Why, walls of brick and plaster are nothing to fairies. I can easily pass through them whenever I wish, and so can Peter and Nuta and Kilter. Is that not so, comrades?
I often pass through the walls when I gather up the letters, said Kilter. And that was a long speech for him, and so surprised Peter and Nuta that their big round eyes nearly popped out of their heads.
Therefore, continued the fairy, you may as well take us with you on your next journey, and when we come to one of those houses with stoves instead of fireplaces, we will distribute the toys to the children without the need of using a chimney.
That seems to me a good plan, replied Santa Claus, well pleased at having solved the problem. We will try it next year. That was how the fairy, the pixie, the nook, and the rill all rode in the sledge with their master the following Christmas Eve, and they had no trouble at all in entering the new-fashioned houses and leaving toys for the children that lived in them. And their deft services not only relieved Santa Claus of much labor, but enabled him to complete his own works more quickly than usual, so that the merry party found themselves at home with an empty sledge a full hour before daybreak. The only drawback to the journey was that the mischievous Whisk persisted in tickling the reindeer with a long feather to see them jump, and Santa Claus found it necessary to watch him every minute and tweak his long ears once or twice to make him behave himself. But, all taken together, the trip was a great success. To this day, the four little folk always accompany Santa Claus on his yearly ride and help him in the distribution of his gifts. But the indifference of parents, which had so annoyed the good saint, did not continue very long, and Santa Claus soon found they were really anxious he should visit the homes on Christmas Eve and leave presents for their children. So, to lighten his task, which was fast becoming very difficult indeed, old Santa decided to ask the parents to assist him. "Get your Christmas trees all ready for my coming," he said to them, "and then I shall be able to leave the presents without loss of time, and you can put them on the trees when I am gone." And to others he said, "See that the children's stockings are hung up in readiness for my coming, and then I can fill them as quick as a wink." And often, when parents were kind and good-natured, Santa Claus would simply fling down his package of gifts and leave the fathers and mothers to fill the stockings after he had darted away in his sledge. "I will make all loving parents my deputies," cried the jolly old fellow, "and they shall help me do my work. For in this way I shall save many precious minutes, and few children need be neglected for lack of time to visit them. Besides, Carrying around the big packs in his swift-flying sledge, old Santa began to send great heaps of toys to the toy shops, so that if parents wanted larger supplies for their children, they could easily get them. And if any children were by chance missed by Santa on his yearly rounds, they could go to the toy shops and get enough to make them happy and contented. For the loving friend of the little ones decided that no child, if he could help it, should long for toys in vain. And the toy shops also proved convenient whenever a child fell ill and needed a new toy to amuse it. And sometimes, on birthdays, the fathers and mothers go to the toy shops and get pretty gifts for their children in honor of the happy event. Perhaps you will now understand how, in spite of the bigness of the world, Santa Claus is able to supply all the children with beautiful gifts. To be sure, the old gentleman is rarely seen these days. It is not because he tries to keep out of sight, I assure you. Santa Claus is the same loving friend of children that in the old days used to play and romp with them by the hour, and I know he would love to do the same now, if he had the time. But you see, he is so busy all the year making toys, and so hurried on that one night when he visits our homes with his packs, that he comes and goes among us like a flash, and it is almost impossible to catch a glimpse of him. And although there are millions and millions more children in the world than there used to be, Santa Claus has never been known to complain of their increasing numbers. "The more the merrier," he cries with his jolly laugh. And the only difference to him is the fact that his little workmen have to make their busy fingers fly faster every year to satisfy the demands of so many little ones. "In all this world, there is nothing so beautiful as a happy child," says good old Santa Claus. And if he had his way, the children would all be beautiful, for all would be happy. And that brings us to the end of The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. This was a fun read. It felt like a parent explaining Santa and how it works to their children. It felt like a parent who has got way too much time on their hands doing so. Which realistically, that's probably exactly what this was. This is probably a story that Baum wrote for his children, and who's like, okay, might as well publish it. Yeah, a very creative parent. And you know what? It works. It explains all of the questions that, well, I won't say all, because children are made to make up new questions, but it explains a lot of the questions away. It gets it answers the chimney question. It answers the how does he do it in one night question. It's so many of the little questions come up, and it's like, okay, here we go. It almost reads like someone was like, Baum was, as he was writing down questions that his kid gave him, he's like, okay, what do we do this? What do we do this? What do we do this? So, this one was a lot of fun. It had the whimsy that we saw with Oz, but with sort of the anchoring and the grounding of being a story and persons, quote unquote, that we're familiar with. So it kind of blended that line between familiar fiction and whimsical fancy. And yeah, this is exactly the vibes you want from a Christmas story. No, not really any preaching, not really anything heavy-handed, just good times all around, a little bit of fantasy sprinkled in, and people that are genuinely very good to each other. Even the worst of the people, the old Baron Braun, I think it was just like, I don't want you in my house. And then his son is like, you know what, I want you in my house. That was about the biggest stretch of person-on-person problems. There were the Aguas, but that was a bit of... I liked the addition of that little plot point. And I liked how I liked how Baum's catched it in the sort of direction of history is all or nothing. You can't ignore it because it's not comfortable. And so it fit nicely in the story, and was a nice little lesson to give. So yeah, I really enjoyed this as a Christmas story in general, and as a good just kid's story. The fact that it took 4 hours, almost 4 hours to read, means it's a little bit heavy for a kid's story, but all the same, this is, I mean, if you're reading it for, that's a bedtime story. You can read a chapter a night to your kid and be like, all right, now, we'll see what happens to Santa next time. That'd work out pretty well. We just go a little all in on this. All right. Well, we finished just a little bit early tonight. And you know what? That's fine. We're reading kids' books. I don't know what we'll be reading next. Our next reading is on Tuesday. This and Christmas Carol were the two big ones that I absolutely wanted to hit. And let me look at the calendar. We've got two weeks and a Tuesday. Yeah, exactly. We've gone over enough lately that an early night won't hurt us. So we've got 2 weeks and a Tuesday to get through, or to have for the seasonal readings. And I'm reasonably sure that, obviously, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas must be read on Tuesday of the 23rd, because that'll be our last reading before Christmas itself. So it's only right. And that should be done in a day and less. So we've got other options and see other Christmas appropriate things. But yeah, if you have any that you would like to hear read, please feel free to suggest them. That gives us, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days to fill. So we've got a lot more time than I expected. We burned through Christmas Carol and this remarkably quickly. But Gutenberg has a vast selection, so if need be, I can fill the time however the needs may be. I've said it time and time again that our format is truly blessed with choice. We have so many options for so many different things. It helps that we're reading books that sometimes are hundreds of years old. That gives us a lot to choose from. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up for the night. It's been a joy to revisit some Christmas classics so far and sort of share in the stories that we grew up with. Give it our own flair as we carry on and approach the holiday that's coming up, and kindle some of that own Christmas spirit that sometimes can be hard to find. I know, for my part, unless I actively make an effort, it can be sometimes difficult to cultivate a sense of good cheer and be ready for the holidays. So making a conscious effort like this is good. It's fun, and is a nice little anchor point. Reminds me that with a little effort, we can all be good to each other. All right, with that little bit of sentimentality out of the way, let's go ahead and call it a night. As always, thank you very much for joining us. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to drop a like on the stream, maybe a subscription to the channel, and let us and the algorithm know that we're doing some good things. That's a good way to put it. When we're kids, the magic is created for us. When it's adults, you have to take things into your own hands. And that, yeah, it's part of growing up. But the creation of magic is every bit as magical. All right. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.